Sometimes the greatest discoveries in history don't come from classified documents or high-level testimonies. They come from something much simpler, a camera that happened to be recording at the right moment, pointed at something nobody thought twice about. A routine scene. Nothing special, nothing dramatic. And yet, when you look at the footage decades later with calm eyes and historical distance, you suddenly notice something unusual. Something that the people filming it didn't realize they were capturing. Something that the pilots, the mechanics, the commanders, the analysts all saw every day, but never interpreted correctly. That's exactly what happened during the Vietnam Air War. Back then, nobody saw the problem. Nobody stopped the film projector and said, "Hold on, this doesn't make sense. Why does this keep happening like that? There's something wrong here." Only years later, when researchers, historians, and even former pilots began reviewing the footage frame by frame, did one question start popping up again and again. How did no one notice this at the time? This documentary is not about conspiracies. It's not about hidden scandals or deliberately buried secrets. It's about something more subtle and far more important. It's about a fundamental flaw in the way the air war was fought. A flaw that affected thousands of missions, shaped countless decisions, and determined outcomes without anyone realizing it, even though the cameras filmed its effects over and over again. To understand that secret, we need to go back to the part of the war that almost never gets any attention. The ground, the runway, the heat, the mud, the mechanical chaos before takeoff, before any bomb fell, before any jet broke the sound barrier, before any pilot spoke over the radio, because the air war didn't begin in the sky. It began on the ground. And strangely enough, that's where the camera first caught the clues no one interpreted correctly. If you watch the footage from that era, you'll see mechanics installing fuses on 750-pound bombs. You'll see men working silently, intensely, treating heavy bombs like fragile glass. You'll see aircraft being rearmed while the sun reflects off hot metal, engines spinning, crews rushing to meet impossible deadlines. Everything looks like routine. But in the Vietnam environment, nothing was routine. Heat, humidity, mud, dust, sudden rainstorms. The conditions were brutal. Nothing about Vietnam was ideal for advanced air operations, and yet dozens of aircraft took off every day as if the environment didn't matter. But it mattered. It mattered a lot. The footage shows mechanics wiping sweat off their faces while tightening bolts for the 4th time. It shows crew chiefs kneeling under the wing, checking the landing gear in the middle of 40-degree heat. It shows weapons teams reinstalling fuses because they don't trust the first alignment. It shows people running between aircraft with tools and cables like firefighters in an emergency. And in the middle of all that, there's the first hint of the secret. The amount of improvisation required to keep the air war running in such hostile conditions. Still, that's only the beginning. The real clue comes when you watch the aircraft on the runway, especially during takeoffs and landings. Most people think the danger of the air war was in the sky. Enemy guns, missiles, dogfights. But the cameras tell a different story. They show jets shaking more than normal. They show tires skidding on uneven surfaces. They show aircraft carving trenches off the side of the runway. They show pilots fighting the controls just to keep the plane straight. They show mechanics sprinting toward a smoking landing gear seconds after touchdown. And all of this was considered normal. The normalization of risk, that's part of the secret. But the real heart of it comes from the air. When you watch Vietnam air footage today, it looks almost majestic for a moment. F-100s slicing through hot air, F-105As diving like steel spears, F-104s streaking across the sky, B-57s opening their bomb bays with that slow, ominous elegance, and the tiny FAC-01 weaving through trees and valleys, trying to see what nobody else could see. But if you look closely, the footage also reveals something no one talked about at the time. Visibility in Vietnam was awful, and that changed everything. You see the FA fire a marking rocket, releasing a thin puff of smoke on the ground. That smoke is supposed to guide the attack. That smoke determines where bombs are dropped. That smoke, in theory, in theory, is the target, but the footage accidentally captures a critical detail. The smoke moves a lot. It changes shape. It drifts sideways. It rises too high. It spreads out. Sometimes it vanishes a moment before the strike aircraft arrive. The wind pulls it. The terrain swallows it. The vegetation distorts the angle. And yet, bombs were dropped as if that smoke were a precise coordinate over and over again. The camera shows jets diving at high speed toward a point of reference that is already shifting in real time. And you start to realize the entire attack system depended on a completely unstable visual marker, F-105S incoming at 700 miles per hour. Pilots with only a few seconds to identify the smoke. FAC aircraft marking targets based on glimpses through trees, bombers committing to drops long before they could verify anything. And the camera shows repeatedly something that simply wasn't discussed enough. Bomb impacts landing far from where the smoke originally was. Not because pilots were incompetent, far from it, but because the environment made precision almost impossible. The jungle hid everything. The smoke moved unpredictably, the weather interfered constantly, and the altitude differences distorted perspective. Everyone saw this with their own eyes, and nobody truly understood what it meant. The most revealing footage comes from the FAC itself. The O-1 films its own marking smoke, and just seconds later, you see the smoke shifting. You see the landscape absorbing it. You see it disappear behind canopy. You see it relocate in the wind. And yet, somewhere above, a jet is already locked into a bombing run. Based on the original mark, the system wasn't broken. It simply wasn't designed for those conditions. The cameras unintentionally captured this reality. They captured the exact reason why so many missions had inconsistent results. Why some attacks were off by dozens or hundreds of meters. Why pilots often returned unsure about what they had hit. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't poor training. It wasn't technology failure. It was something much simpler. The war relied on a visual system that the jungle constantly sabotaged. And that is the beginning of the secret. A secret that was filmed over and over without anyone realizing. What the cameras captured in the sky was surprising, but what they captured on the ground was even more revealing and far stranger than most people realize. Because the secret of the Vietnam Air War wasn't just about drifting smoke or confusing terrain. It wasn't even about the difficulty of targeting through a jungle that swallowed everything alive. The deeper truth was this: the entire system depended on a chain of assumptions. Assumptions made by the FAC, assumptions made by the strike aircraft, assumptions made by commanders in air-conditioned rooms far away from the noise of the runway, and assumptions made by analysts reviewing footage days later. Nobody had a complete picture. Nobody could have a complete picture. And the more you watch the surviving footage, the more obvious this becomes. You start noticing things that don't line up. A fact marking a target that's barely visible. A flight of F-105 taking off heavily loaded. Fighting for lift F-105 is diving in on a point that looks different depending on the angle of the camera. B-57s dropping bombs through a haze so thick you can barely see the ground. Pilots returning to base visibly confused, sometimes frustrated, sometimes silent. Yet on paper, the mission summary might say, target destroyed, objective neutralized, strike successful. The footage tells a different story, not because someone lied intentionally, but because no one really knew what the truth was. When you rely on visual markers in an environment that constantly changes them, uncertainty becomes normal. And when uncertainty becomes normal, people stop questioning it. This is where the secret begins to take shape. The system functioned even when nobody could verify the results. In fact, the system expected people to act without full understanding. It demanded it. There's a reason pilots often describe the air war as flying blind, and they meant it literally and metaphorically. Let's start with visibility. The Vietnam jungle was unlike anything the U.S. Air Force had ever faced. It wasn't just dense, it was layered, three-dimensional, and constantly reshaping itself with shadows, smoke, and humidity. At different altitudes, the same piece of terrain looked completely different. From 5,000 feet, a tree line looked solid. From 500 feet, it looked full of holes. From treetop level, it looked like an endless green labyrinth. Now add to that the weather, rapidly forming clouds, monsoon walls, fog that rolled in like a living creature, dust storms kicked up by nearby explosions. This wasn't bad weather. This was combat weather, the kind that could change the course of a mission in seconds. There are multiple clips where the FAC's marking smoke rises into a layer of wind shear and suddenly bends sideways at an angle you would never expect. The FAC sees it and adjusts mentally, but the F-105, diving from far above, never sees the adjustment. It sees the original mark. These moments were captured unintentionally. No one filming thought this was important, but when you watch them now, you realize how crucial they were. Then there's the matter of speed. The footage makes something painfully clear. Attack aircraft were too fast to make fine adjustments. The F-105, for example, was often flying at more than 600 miles per hour during a bomb run. At those speeds, a tiny misreading of distance or direction became a miss of dozens of meters, sometimes more. You can see it in the footage of thuds diving through haze. By the time the pilot sees the smoke, he has maybe 2 seconds to decide. 2 seconds to correct for wind, 2 seconds to judge if the FAC's mark is still accurate, 2 seconds to determine if anti-aircraft fire is coming from the right place. That's not targeting, that's controlled chaos. But the system needed results, and pilots did their best. They trusted the process, because they had no choice. Here's where the runway footage becomes important again. You notice that many aircraft return with scorch marks, chipped paint, damaged panels, landing gear stress. You see pilots stepping down from their cockpits, looking mentally drained, not because the mission was necessarily dangerous, but because it was confusing. Imagine flying through clouds, smoke, incoming fire, jungle glare, river reflections, and the constant fear of misjudging the terrain, all while trying to spot a target that may or may not be exactly where a puff of smoke says it is. That kind of pressure changes how you perceive the world. It changes how you report results. It changes what you believe happened. And that's the heart of the secret. The air war relied heavily on perception, and perception was often distorted. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just unavoidably. The cameras caught this distortion in real time. Sometimes the FAC's own cockpit footage shows the pilot looking down at a point he marked 2 minutes earlier, and the scene on the ground already looks different. Smoke has shifted, trees are moving, something that looked like a bunker is now obscured by mist. Meanwhile, a bomber is already committed to its run. There's no way to cancel, no time to verify. This gap between what the FAC saw and what the strike aircraft acted on shows up in the footage over and over. It's not a flaw in the aircraft. It's not a failure of training. It's not a bad decision by any pilot. It's simply the result of fighting a war in a place where the environment itself was the enemy. The jungle deceived you, the weather betrayed you, the terrain lied to you, the smoke marked the wrong place. And you didn't know it until it was too late, if you ever found out at all. This brings us to one of the most striking things in the footage: pilots returning to base. Watch the body language. Some pilots walk quickly, trying to leave the aircraft behind as soon as possible. Others descend slowly as if processing what just happened. Even through grainy footage, you can see the questions in their posture. Did I hit the right thing? Was that really the target? Why didn't the FAC confirm? Why did the smoke shift? Did the bomb fall where I think it fell? These were not unusual questions. They were constant companions. And the cameras were rolling, capturing everything. The uncertainty, the quiet tension, the subtle disconnect between what the mission claimed and what the pilots felt. The biggest clue of all comes from the maintenance footage. Technicians examining aircraft after a mission sometimes circle areas of the fuselage with chalk, areas that shouldn't have taken damage if the attack went as planned, damage from debris, damage from unexpected ground fire. damage from something exploding at a different angle than anticipated. The camera shows the chalk marks clearly. It shows mechanics discussing, pointing, analyzing. That's when you realize the aircraft themselves were giving away the truth. They came back carrying the fingerprints of what really happened, not the version written in reports a jet hit from the side instead of the front. A panel scorched from an explosion farther away than expected. A landing gear stressed from an improvised approach through unexpected turbulence. All of these details were filmed without any awareness of what they implied. This is why the footage is so valuable. It's not staged. It's not edited for narrative. It's accidental truth. And piece by piece, it reveals the secret. The Vietnam Air War was far more uncertain, imprecise, and improvisational than anyone ever admitted at the time. The jungle wasn't just hiding the enemy. It was hiding the truth. And the cameras, without intending to, caught glimpses of that truth. The more you study the old footage, the clearer it becomes. The Vietnam Air War wasn't a battle between aircraft and enemy positions. It was a battle between air crews and uncertainty. Uncertainty shaped everything. It shaped how targets were found. It shaped how attacks were executed. It shaped how missions were evaluated afterward. And eventually, it shaped the entire strategy of the air campaign. But what makes the footage so striking is that almost no one at the time recognized the pattern. The camera captured the clues, but the people watching them didn't know what they were looking at. This wasn't anyone's fault. It's simply what happens when you're in the middle of a system that you assume is working, even when it isn't. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the recordings of coordination. Coordination was supposed to be the backbone of the air war. FAC spots the target. FAC marks the target. Fighters or bombers attack the target, simple in theory. In reality, the footage reveals something else. Let's start with the FAC-01. On paper, the FAC was the eye in the sky, but the 01 was one of the slowest, most vulnerable aircraft in the theater. It flew low enough to be hit by small arms fire, and it had to orbit long enough to find and mark targets under a canopy of jungle that never stayed still. Watching the footage, you notice something subtle but important. The FAC is constantly repositioning, not because he wants to, but because he has to. The jungle hides things. The terrain blocks angles. Smoke moves. Sun glare changes. Ground fire erupts from unexpected spots. The FAC spends a surprising amount of time simply trying to orient himself. And the camera catches all of it. You see rapid banking, circling, leaning out the window to get a better view. These weren't smooth reconnaissance flights. These were desperate attempts to understand the battlefield. And while the FAC is trying to make sense of the ground, the strike aircraft are already approaching. This is where the footage becomes unintentionally revealing. When the FAC finally fires the marking rocket, the smoke that appears on the ground looks clean and crisp for about 3 seconds. Then the environment takes over. The smoke drifts, it expands, it becomes obscured by trees, it gets swallowed by a sudden gust of wind or a rising heat column. Now imagine you're the pilot of an F-105. You are flying toward that tiny puff of smoke at hundreds of miles per hour. You have only a brief moment, a few seconds at best, to visually confirm it. If you miss that moment, you're essentially guessing. But here's the part the footage exposes brilliantly. Even when the FAC and the strike aircraft both saw the smoke, they weren't seeing the same thing. Different angles, different distances, different lighting, different levels of visibility, different layers of smoke, different interpretations. This isn't speculation, it's right there in the film. One clip shows the FAC marking a target along a tree line. Another clip from the fighter aircraft approaching shows the smoke in what appears to be a slightly different location because terrain features hide part of it. Another clip from a gun camera shows the smoke nearly blending into the background. All 3 camera perspectives capture the same moment, and yet none of them match perfectly. If 3 cameras couldn't agree, how could 3 pilots? This is the core of the secret. The system looked precise from the outside but was imprecise from the inside. And here's where the footage goes from interesting to astonishing. You begin to notice that some attacks land slightly off target. Not massively, but consistently, maybe 20 meters to the left, maybe 40 meters beyond the mark, maybe right between two likely enemy positions instead of directly on one. Individually, these discrepancies seem minor, but collectively they point to an operation built on fragile assumptions. Pilots often said that bomb runs were educated guesses. Watching the footage, you realize they were being literal. This was not incompetence. This was not poor training. These were skilled aviators fighting a war designed around tools that the environment constantly undermined. And if the smoke wasn't the only unreliable element, the timing was another. Timing mattered almost as much as location. A fact would spot something, but by the time he finished describing it over the radio, the terrain already looked different. By the time he fired the marking rocket, the enemy may have moved. By the time the smoke rose, vegetation was already shifting. By the time the fighters arrived, the wind had already distorted the marker. The footage shows this beautifully. Jets diving toward a piece of smoke that looks different from what the FX saw just moments before. It's like trying to hit a target painted on the surface of a lake. The surface moves, ripples, distorts. In other words, pilots weren't attacking a fixed point. They were attacking a constantly changing idea of a point. And this becomes even more striking when you examine the aftermath footage. The scenes after the jets released their bombs. This footage didn't receive much attention at the time because everyone focused on the explosions. But if you watch closely, you see something else. You see craters in places that suggest the pilot misjudged his angle. You see patterns of bomb strikes that reveal a shift in wind direction. You see impacts scattered slightly to one side of the intended zone. These are not catastrophic errors. These are consistent, systematic deviations, and they tell us something important. The entire air war was being nudged, again and again, by forces no one could fully control. Pilots returned to base with that knowledge in the back of their minds. It's visible in their expressions when they step down from the cockpit. Not fear, but a kind of mental exhaustion. The exhaustion of trying to do precision work with imperfect tools. The footage shows pilots leaving their aircraft and heading straight to debriefs. Some walk with determination. Some look frustrated. Some look confused. Some simply look tired. You never hear their conversations, but the body language says enough. Meanwhile, the aircraft tell a story of their own, B-57s landing with scorch marks on unexpected parts of the fuselage. F-100s returning with dust and debris on the wings in patterns that suggest the bombs went off at unexpected angles. F-104s showing stress on their landing gear after being forced into low visibility approaches. Mechanics gather around these aircraft, pointing at the damage, marking affected areas with chalk, shaking their heads, sometimes laughing out of disbelief. Again, all of it caught on film. None of it intentionally recorded as evidence. But looking back now, it's impossible to ignore every small inconsistency, every strange impact angle. Every minor deviation paints the same picture. The war was being fought with incomplete information, and everyone was improvising. This wasn't a precision war. It was a war of approximations. And yet, officially, precision was the goal. The footage shows the gap between expectation and reality. It shows the difference between how the war was imagined and how it was actually experienced. And that gap is where the secret lies. What's remarkable is how normal this all felt to the people who lived it. Pilots didn't think of these inconsistencies as shocking. Mechanics didn't see unexpected damage as unusual. Facts didn't treat shifting smoke as a disaster. It was just how things were. But now, decades later, when you piece together all these fragments, the drifting smoke, the hurried takeoffs, the mid-flight adjustments, the uncertain landings, the confused pilots, the damaged aircraft, you start to see the truth forming. Not one moment, not one incident, not one revelation. A pattern, a systemic, unavoidable environmental pattern. The cameras captured it by accident. The crews lived it without fully understanding it, and the war's results were shaped by it far more than anyone at the time realized. There's a particular kind of silence in historical footage, the kind that only becomes meaningful decades later. It's the silence of people who are too busy surviving the moment to realize that they're revealing something important. It's the silence of a camera operator who thinks he's just documenting routine procedures, when in truth he's capturing evidence of something no one fully understood at the time. And this silence becomes deafening when you watch the footage from Vietnam through modern eyes. Because by now, after reviewing the takeoffs, the smoke drift, the misaligned impacts, the pilots returning in confusion, the stressed landing gear, the facts struggling against terrain and weather, one thing becomes clear. The Vietnam Air War was not a precision conflict. It was a conflict of controlled uncertainty. Everything depended on things pilots couldn't fully see. Everything depended on interpretations, assumptions, best guesses, and the camera saw it all without anyone telling them what to look for. But if the smoke and visibility were the first layers of the secret, the next layer is something even more surprising. The war wasn't only visually uncertain, it was informationally uncertain. And the footage proves it. Look closely at the recordings of pilots stepping off their aircraft after missions. You see brief exchanges, a nod, a hand gesture, a shrug. None of it looks dramatic, but it tells a story. These tiny gestures reveal a truth the military rarely emphasized. Pilots often didn't know whether they had hit the right target, even after returning to base. That uncertainty shows up repeatedly in the camera footage. There are shots of pilots staring at the ground as they walk away, helmets dangling from their hands, brows furrowed, not anger, not fear, just uncertainty, a kind of mental static. Even in grainy film, you can see the question forming, what actually happened out there? And then there's the footage from the debriefing areas. The cameras were often rolling candidly, not because anyone intended to capture secrets, but because these were routine documentation shots meant for training or archives. In these clips, you see pilots pointing at rough sketch maps, tracing lines in the air with their fingers, drawing circles in the dirt, gesturing uncertainly toward an imagined landscape. They're trying to describe something that even they didn't fully understand. And then comes the most revealing part. The footage shows multiple pilots describing the same mission in noticeably different ways. One pilot gestures that the target was just past the tree line. Another says it was midway along the river bend. Another draws a spot that is several hundred meters from either description. These aren't mistakes. They're symptoms. Symptoms of a system built on inconsistent visual cues. And yet, none of these discrepancies were seen as alarming. They were interpreted as natural variations. This is where the heart of the secret starts to become shockingly clear. The Vietnam Air War was fought on imperfect understanding, but everyone acted as if the understanding were perfect, and the footage, unknowingly, proves it. Then comes the footage of aircraft in flight. At a glance, it looks routine. Jets cruising, FAC observing, bomb bays open. But watch closely. There's something subtle and unusual happening. Some aircraft make last-second adjustments in mid-dive. A slight bank, a tiny correction barely noticeable, unless you freeze the frame. Why does this matter? Because these micro-adjustments usually mean the pilot lost visual reference. Perhaps the smoke shifted, perhaps the terrain changed appearance. Perhaps the sun angle made something look different. Perhaps what he thought was the marker wasn't actually the marker. Every micro-adjustment is the pilot quietly saying, I'm not entirely sure. And yet, he must continue, because pulling out early is more dangerous than pressing on. The footage also shows B-57s releasing their bombs into thick haze. You can't see the ground clearly. The pilots couldn't either. They often relied on timing alone. Release now, hope the FAC marked correctly. This was normal procedure. It wasn't a flaw. It was simply how the war worked. Now consider the footage of maintenance crews marking unusual impact points on aircraft. Why is this important? Because these markings reveal where ground fire came from. And often it wasn't where the intelligence expected. On film, you see mechanics circling small bullet holes in unexpected locations. If the aircraft had attacked from the correct angle on the correct target, the damage should have come from predictable directions. But the footage shows otherwise. Damage from below when the enemy was supposed to be ahead. Damage from above when the target area had no high ground. Damage on the right wing when the aircraft should have been banked. Left damage concentrated at angles that suggest the aircraft was not where the plan said it was. Again, none of this was dramatic. None of this seemed unusual at the time. But now, watching it as a historian, you see the truth emerging. They weren't hitting what they thought they were hitting, and the enemy wasn't where they expected the enemy to be, and the cameras captured it, quietly, accidentally, over and over. Here's something even more striking. There are clips showing bombs being loaded onto aircraft while the crews discuss wind direction. At first, this looks like routine operational chatter. But then you notice something. They're worried about ground-level wind, even though the strike aircraft will release bombs thousands of feet above. Why? Because the marking smoke is at ground level. In other words, the entire mission outcome depended on a wind pattern that could change minute by minute, and nobody had precise measurements of it. The footage unintentionally documents the fragility of this system: ground-level wind, mid-altitude shear, high-altitude crossflow, all affecting where bombs actually landed. But the real turning point, the moment where the footage reveals the secret in its most unmistakable form, is in the scenes of FAC aircraft filming their own marks. In one clip, the FAC fires a marking rocket. It hits the ground, smoke rises, but the O1 circles, and from the new angle, you can see the smoke drifting, not slightly, but significantly, a few meters at first, then more. Then it breaks apart into separate wisps, and yet, at that exact moment, you can hear the FAC voice over the radio in later transcriptions. Mark is good, cleared, hot. He wasn't lying, he was acting on what he saw from one angle. From another angle, captured by the camera, the mark wasn't nearly as clear. That clip, that single moment, is one of the most important accidental recordings of the entire air war. It shows visually, plainly, undeniably, how the entire attack system could be misled by something as simple as wind over foliage. This was not a rare occurrence. It was constant. And now, decades later, the footage lets us see what the pilots couldn't see in real time. A war built on approximations, fought with incomplete visibility, analyzed with incomplete evidence, and executed under the assumption of precision that didn't actually exist. The biggest irony, nobody meant to hide this. Nobody even realized it. It was simply invisible, until we had the distance to recognize what the cameras had captured unintentionally. By now, after watching the takeoffs, the drifting smoke, the pilots returning unsure, the unexpected damage on aircraft, the micro-corrections in mid-dive, the FAC struggling for angles, the strange crater patterns on the ground, a larger truth begins to form. It doesn't appear suddenly. It emerges slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, piece by piece, clue by clue, frame by frame, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The biggest secret of the Vietnam Air War, the one recorded on film entirely by accident, is this. The air war wasn't a battle of technology versus enemy. It was a battle of technology versus environment. The jungle dictated everything. The weather dictated everything. The terrain dictated everything. The wind dictated everything. The visibility dictated everything. The timing, the target, the angle, the outcome, everything. The United States Air Force came to Vietnam with the most advanced strike aircraft in the world, F-100s, F-104s, F-105s, B-57s, supported by dedicated forward air controllers. Complex systems, high-performance jets, precision weapons by the standards of the 1960s, and none of that could overcome the simplest problem imaginable. You cannot precisely hit what you cannot reliably see. In retrospect, the footage almost feels like a warning, a quiet message from the past that no one heard at the time because the truth was never hidden. It was simply overlooked. You can see it clearly in the recordings of FAC missions. The O-1 pilots had to thread their way through valleys and treetops, relying on glimpses, intuition, experience. They marked targets with rockets designed for visibility, not accuracy. They watched smoke drift and thought it was close enough, not because they were careless, but because they were fighting a war that didn't allow for perfect conditions. And then the strike aircraft arrived. Thunderchiefs and Super Sabres diving at incredible speeds, trusting a single puff of smoke to be their guiding reference. That trust wasn't misplaced. It was necessary. Without it, the system collapsed. But trust doesn't equal precision, and the footage exposes that gap more clearly than any written report ever could. Look again at the bomb impact patterns captured on film. Not the dramatic explosions, the details. The craters slightly off to the side. The sequence of blasts trailing in a diagonal line caused by crosswinds at altitude. The subtle but consistent misalignment between where the FAC mark appeared to be and where the bombs actually fell. It's all right there, in black and white, hidden in plain sight. Nobody in the moment noticed the pattern because everyone assumed the system worked. Everyone assumed that if the FAC marked the target and the pilot released on time, the attack must have been accurate. But the cameras were documenting something else entirely. They were showing that the environment was constantly rewriting the mission, shifting the smoke, obscuring the target, throwing off depth perception, distorting angles. And what's even more revealing is how calm everyone looks in the footage. Pilots walking away without celebration or despair, just quiet processing, maintenance crews examining odd damage without panic. Just analysis. FAC pilots circling with determination, not frustration, because this was normal to them, normal. That's the key word. The secret wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a conspiracy. The secret was that the Vietnam Air War functioned on assumptions that everyone accepted as normal, even though the cameras clearly show those assumptions breaking down over and over again. Smoke that wouldn't stay still, terrain that misled the eye, weather that changed faster than radio calls could keep up, pilots forced to decide in seconds what should have taken minutes, targets that looked solid from one angle and invisible from another, aircraft returning with evidence of trajectories that didn't match mission briefings. The war wasn't failing. It was simply being fought within a physical reality that no one fully understood, a reality the footage captured unintentionally. And here is the final truth the cameras reveal. The air war wasn't imprecise because of human error. It was imprecise because the environment made precision impossible. This doesn't diminish the pilots. It doesn't diminish the fakies. It doesn't diminish the mechanics or the planners. If anything, it highlights their skill even more. They operated in conditions where modern precision would still struggle today. And they did it with analog equipment, unreliable weather reporting, and visual targeting methods vulnerable to every variable imaginable. The footage shows them doing the impossible, not perfectly, not flawlessly, but consistently, day after day. And maybe that's the real story hidden in these accidental recordings. Not a failure, but a contradiction. A war fought with the attention of precision, but the reality of uncertainty. A war where heroes flew into situations no human could fully control. A war where the jungle, not the enemy, dictated the terms of engagement. All of it caught on camera. Not by design, not as evidence, not as revelation, just as routine. But time has a way of changing what routine means. The same footage that once looked ordinary now looks extraordinary. It allows us to see the truth not as the pilot saw it, not as the commander saw it, but as history sees it, with clarity, distance, and perspective. And that truth is simple, humbling, and unforgettable. The biggest secret of the Vietnam Air War wasn't hidden. It was visible the entire time. The camera captured it, the war recorded it, but only now do we truly understand it. The environment was the real battlefield. The uncertainty was the real enemy. And the films, these quiet, unassuming films, were the only witnesses that recognized it. Because sometimes the camera doesn't just record history, sometimes it reveals it.